The archival records of Baal Secundus hold fragmented yet tantalizing insights into the earliest days of Dante's bloodline. Long before his ascension to chapter master, the world of Baal was a harsh, irradiated wasteland where survival itself was a brutal test of genetic fitness. Tribes of post-apocalyptic warriors battled across scorched landscapes, their bodies adapted to withstand extreme radiation and perpetual conflict. The Blood Angels, founded by their primarch Sanguinius, emerged from this crucible of survival. During the Great Crusade, the Legion represented the pinnacle of genetic engineering and martial prowess. Their reputation preceded them, not just as warriors, but as the most aesthetically perfect of the Emperor's legions. Each Marine bore the genetic legacy of Sanguinius, impossibly beautiful, yet capable of unleashing unprecedented violence. Before Dante's birth, the genetic lines of Baal were carefully monitored. The recruitment processes of the Blood Angels were notoriously selective, with potential aspirants facing a gauntlet of tests that would obliterate lesser men. Candidates underwent genetic screening that went far beyond physical capability, examining deep genetic markers that hinted at potential resonance with the chapter's complex gene seed. The specific bloodline from which Dante originated was notable for its unusual genetic stability. While most tribes on Baal suffered from severe genetic degradation due to radiation, his ancestors showed remarkable resilience. Preliminary genetic analyses suggest they inhabited the most protected regions of Baal Secundus, areas slightly less devastated by nuclear and chemical conflicts that had reduced most of the planet to radioactive dust. Historical fragments suggest Dante's earliest ancestors were not just survivors, but leaders. Archaeological evidence from pre-recruitment tribal records indicates his lineage consistently produced individuals with extraordinary leadership capabilities. They weren't just warriors, but strategists who could unite fractured groups and make critical decisions under extreme environmental pressures. When Dante was eventually identified as a potential Space Marine recruit, he stood out even among an exceptional group of candidates. Recruitment assessments noted his unusual combination of genetic markers, extraordinary physical resilience, neural plasticity that suggested advanced tactical thinking, and a genetic profile that showed minimal drift from baseline human genetic structures. The Blood Angels of the Great Crusade were more than just a military force. They were a cultural and genetic phenomenon. Under Sanguinius's leadership, they represented a perfect fusion of martial discipline, artistic sensibility, and near-mythical combat capabilities. Their battles were not just military engagements, but complex choreographies of violence, with each Marine moving with an almost supernatural grace and precision. During this period, the diversity within the Legion was remarkable. Unlike some more monolithic legions, the Blood Angels embraced individual expression within a framework of absolute loyalty. Each Marine was expected to be not just a weapon, but a complete warrior artist, capable of both incredible destruction and profound aesthetic appreciation. The geneseed of the Blood Angels carried unique genetic structures that would later manifest in complex psychological and physiological traits. The nascent signs of what would become the Black Rage and Red Thirst were already present, though not yet fully understood. Marines, like the young Dante, represented the cutting edge of this genetic exploration. individuals who might potentially overcome or control these inherent genetic challenges. Technological and genetic records from this era are frustratingly incomplete. The age of strife and subsequent Horus Heresy resulted in massive information loss. What remains are tantalizing fragments, genetic assessments, partial tribal histories, and cryptic references that hint at a far more complex narrative than conventional imperial histories suggest. Dante's early potential was not just about physical capability, but about a rare combination of genetic markers that suggested extraordinary adaptability. Where other potential recruits might show excellence in singular domains, Dante's genetic profile hinted at a more holistic excellence, tactical thinking, physiological resilience, and a rare psychological stability that would become crucial in his later leadership. The context of Baal during the Great Crusade was one of constant transformation. As the Emperor's forces expanded across the galaxy, worlds like Baal were rapidly changing from isolated survival zones to potential galactic contributors. The recruitment processes of the Blood Angels were part of this larger narrative of human potential being systematically identified and weaponized. The genetic potential that marked Dante's early years would be brutally tested during the Horus Heresy, a period that would fundamentally shatter the structural integrity of the Imperium and transform the Blood Angels forever. When Horus's betrayal erupted, the Legion found itself at the epicenter of a galactic civil war that would redefine warfare and psychological trauma for millennia to come. The Blood Angels suffered particularly devastating losses during the Siege of Terra. Their Primarch, Sanguinius, perhaps the most aesthetically and martially perfect of the Emperor's sons, was murdered by Horus in a confrontation that would become legendary. This single moment of genetic and spiritual trauma would cascade through the Legion's genetic memory, dramatically amplifying the psychological instabilities already present in their gene seed. The red thirst and black rage, genetic psychological conditions unique to the Blood Angels, transformed from latent genetic quirks into full-blown existential challenges. Where previously these genetic flaws had been manageable, the trauma of losing Sanguinius triggered a fundamental genetic cascade that would haunt the chapter for 10,000 years. The red thirst manifested as an almost vampiric biological imperative, an uncontrollable desire to consume the blood of fallen enemies. Marines afflicted would enter states of savage, near uncontrollable combat frenzy. Tactical formations would suddenly dissolve as affected Marines would break ranks, hurling themselves into enemy formations with a savage, almost sentient hunger. The Black Rage was even more terrifying. Affected Marines would essentially relive the final moments of Sanguinius's death, experiencing his terminal confrontation with Horus as a continuous, inescapable psychological loop. These Marines would become walking psychological trauma engines, skilled warriors trapped in a perpetual moment of extreme emotional and genetic anguish. Dante emerged during this period of maximum genetic and institutional instability. While other chapters might have fractured or collapsed under such psychological pressure, the Blood Angels developed complex institutional mechanisms to manage these genetic challenges. Specialized units like the Death Company were created, essentially controlled zones of psychological warfare where Marines suffering from the Black Rage could be strategically deployed. The survival strategies developed during this period would become foundational to the Blood Angels' future existence. Instead of viewing the Red Thirst and Black Rage as weaknesses, Dante's predecessors and contemporaries began to see them as unique tactical capabilities. A Marine in the grip of the Black Rage became a living weapon, feeling no pain, experiencing no fear, capable of unleashing levels of violence that would shock even other Space Marines. Genetic records from this period are fragmented, but suggest that Dante represented a potential evolutionary response to these challenges, where most Marines would be completely consumed by the genetic instabilities. He showed remarkable psychological resilience. His genetic markers suggested an ability to interface with these traumatic genetic memories without being completely overwhelmed. The broader imperial context during this period cannot be understated. The Imperium was essentially experiencing a total systemic collapse. Communication networks failed, entire sector administrations vanished, and the fundamental promise of human unity disintegrated. Against this backdrop, the Blood Angels were not just fighting external enemies, but conducting an internal war against their own genetic programming. Technological and medical interventions became crucial. The Adeptus Mechanicus and the chapter's own apothecaries developed increasingly sophisticated psychological dampening techniques. Neural filters, genetic recalibration protocols, and even rudimentary psychic suppression methods were employed to manage the genetic instabilities. Dante's early career was defined by navigating these complex genetic and institutional challenges. He wasn't just a warrior or a leader, but essentially a living experiment in genetic management. Each battle became not just a military engagement, but a test of the chapter's ability to maintain coherence in the face of fundamental genetic trauma. The psychological landscape of the Blood Angels during this period was incredibly complex. Marines weren't just fighting external enemies, but constantly battling internal genetic imperatives that threatened to consume them. The line between controlled warfare and uncontrolled genetic violence became increasingly blurred. Recruitment protocols became increasingly sophisticated. Potential Marines were no longer just assessed on physical capabilities, but on their potential psychological resilience. Genetic screening became a complex art form, with apothecaries and psychers working in concert to identify individuals who might successfully integrate the chapter's challenging gene seed. The survival of the Blood Angels was never guaranteed. Many believed the chapter would eventually consume itself, with the Black Rage and Red Thirst representing an evolutionary dead end. Dante would emerge as a crucial figure in proving these pessimistic projections wrong, a living testament to the chapter's capacity for adaptation and survival. The transition of leadership within the Blood Angels was never a straightforward process. Traditional chapter hierarchies had been systematically dismantled during the most brutal periods of imperial regression, leaving behind a fragmented organizational structure that demanded radical reimagination. Dante's ascension was not just unprecedented, it was a statistical anomaly that would have been considered impossible in earlier imperial doctrines. At an age when most Space Marines were still considered junior battle brothers, Dante demonstrated strategic capabilities that defied conventional understanding of martial leadership. his tactical insights went beyond mere battlefield mechanics, representing a holistic approach to warfare that integrated psychological, genetic, and strategic dimensions. The previous chapter, Leadership, had been decimated during a series of catastrophic engagements against multiple Xenos threats. The Blood Angels had lost nearly 60% of their senior command structure in a brutal campaign against an unexpected Necron dynasty emerging from the Ultima Segmentum. These losses created a leadership vacuum that conventional chapter protocols were ill-equipped to address. Genetic and psychological assessments of Dante revealed something extraordinary. Where most Space Marines showed predictable response patterns, his neural mapping demonstrated unprecedented adaptive capabilities. Neurological scans suggested he could process tactical information at speeds that bordered on precognitive perception. It wasn't just about faster thinking. His cognitive architecture seemed fundamentally different from his peers. The formal mechanisms of his ascension were complex, a combination of battlefield performance metrics, genetic potential assessments, and recommendations from surviving senior commanders converged to create an unprecedented leadership transition. Traditional chapter hierarchies typically required decades of systematic progression through ranks. Dante bypassed these entire mechanisms in a matter of years. His earliest strategic victories were not just military engagements, but complex, multi-dimensional conflicts that redefined warfare for the Blood Angels. In the Gehenna campaign, he orchestrated a series of tactical maneuvers against Orc forces that were mathematically improbable. By identifying subtle genetic communication patterns within the Orc hive mind, he was able to predict and systematically disrupt their strategic coordination. The rebuilding of the Blood Angels required more than just tactical acumen. Dante understood that the chapter's survival depended on fundamentally reimagining its institutional structure. The genetic challenges posed by the Black Rage and Red Thirst could no longer be managed through traditional containment strategies. He developed comprehensive psychological intervention protocols that transformed these genetic flaws into strategic advantages. Recruitment protocols were completely overhauled. Instead of relying on traditional screening methods, Dante implemented a multi-layered assessment system that examined potential recruits across genetic, psychological, and neurological dimensions. Potential Marines were no longer just evaluated on physical capabilities, but on their capacity to interface with the chapter's complex genetic legacy. The technological interventions he implemented were nothing short of revolutionary. Collaboration with Adeptus Mechanicus Genitors resulted in the development of neural stabilization implants that could mitigate the most extreme manifestations of the Black Rage. These were not simple suppressant technologies, but complex genetic interface mechanisms that allowed Marines to maintain operational effectiveness while managing their inherent psychological challenges. Logistical reconstruction became a primary strategic focus. The Blood Angels had been reduced to approximately 40% of their previous operational capacity. Dante's approach wasn't just about numerical replacement, but about qualitative transformation. Each new recruit was seen as a potential evolutionary step for the chapter, not just a replacement for fallen warriors. Strategic partnerships were carefully cultivated. Dante understood that the chapter's survival depended on complex institutional networks, diplomatic engagements with other Space Marine chapters, Adeptus Mechanicus research divisions, and imperial administrative structures were meticulously orchestrated to provide the Blood Angels with resources and strategic flexibility. The psychological management of the chapter became as important as its martial capabilities. Dante implemented comprehensive psychological training programs that went beyond traditional Space Marine conditioning. Marines were taught not just to manage their genetic impulses, but to understand them as complex biological communication systems. Equipment and technological infrastructure were completely reimagined. Standard loadouts were replaced with more flexible, adaptable systems that could be rapidly modified based on emerging tactical requirements. Weapon systems were developed that could interface directly with a Marine's genetic and psychological state, creating a more integrated combat organism. Intelligence gathering mechanisms were expanded dramatically. Where previous chapter structures relied on relatively limited information networks, Dante developed multi-layered intelligence systems that could process information across planetary, sector, and segmentum levels. This wasn't just about gathering more data, but about developing more sophisticated analytical frameworks. The transformation was so profound that many traditionalist elements within the Imperium viewed it with significant suspicion. Dante was not just rebuilding a chapter, he was essentially creating a new kind of Space Marine organization that challenged fundamental assumptions about genetic engineering, psychological management, and martial capability. The Tyranid invasion of the Baal system represented a level of existential threat that surpassed virtually every previous Xenos engagement in Imperial history. The Hive Fleet Leviathan, a massive, coherent biological weapon that functioned more like a single organism than a traditional military force, represented the absolute apex of evolutionary warfare. Dante's strategic preparations had been ongoing for decades before the actual invasion. Understanding the fundamental nature of Tyranid biology, he recognized that traditional defensive strategies would be catastrophically insufficient. The Hive Fleet wasn't just an invading force, it was a complete ecosystem designed to consume and integrate every biological resource in its path. Preliminary astrographic scans detected the first tendrils of Leviathan approximately 37 standard years before direct contact. These weren't simple reconnaissance missions, but complex biological probes that would systematically map genetic potential, environmental resources, and defensive capabilities of target systems. Each probe was essentially a living intelligence gathering mechanism capable of transmitting vast amounts of biochemical and tactical information back to the central hive consciousness. The genetic infrastructure of Baal itself became a critical defensive asset. The radiation-scarred landscapes that had once been a brutal training ground for Space Marine recruitment now represented a complex defensive terrain. Geological formations, mutated vegetation, and the planet's inherently hostile environment would become integral to the defensive strategy. Dante's tactical approach rejected conventional Imperial defensive doctrines. Instead of creating static defensive lines, he developed a fluid, adaptive strategy that would turn the entire planetary system into a massive, integrated combat organism. Defensive positions were not fixed fortifications, but complex, mobile networks that could rapidly reconfigure based on Tyranid movement patterns. The initial waves of the invasion defied conventional military comprehension. Millions of bioengineered organisms would be launched as essentially expendable genetic missiles, probing defensive capabilities and consuming biological matter simultaneously. These weren't traditional soldiers, but living weapons designed to gather information, consume resources, and prepare terrain for subsequent waves. Genetic analysis of captured Tyranid organisms revealed something extraordinary. Each individual bioform carried complex genetic memories that could be rapidly transmitted across the entire hive fleet. A tactical insight gained by a single creature would be instantaneously integrated into the collective strategic consciousness. This wasn't just rapid adaptation. It was a form of distributed intelligence that made traditional military planning obsolete. The Blood Angels, along with recruited PDF forces and several other Imperial defense units, transformed Baal into a comprehensive killing zone. Defensive technologies were developed that could interface directly with the planet's existing geological and biological infrastructure. Massive underground complexes were converted into biological counter-invasion systems, capable of generating localized electromagnetic disruption fields that could temporarily disable Tyranid bioforms. Dante's most revolutionary tactical innovation was the development of what Imperial strategists would later call genetic disruption protocols. By understanding the Tyranids' complex biological communication networks, he could generate targeted genetic interference signals. These weren't simple jamming technologies, but sophisticated genetic noise that could temporarily destabilize the hive fleet's collective decision-making processes. The scale of the invasion defied human comprehension. Estimates suggested that the initial invasion waves comprised approximately 17 billion individual bioforms, ranging from microscopic genetic infiltrators to massive biotitans that could consume entire urban complexes in minutes. Each organism was not just a weapon, but a complex biological tool designed for specific tactical and consumption purposes. Recruitment and reinforcement became a critical strategic consideration. Dante implemented emergency genetic acceleration protocols that could rapidly convert potential recruits into combat-ready space marines. Traditional recruitment timelines that typically spanned years were compressed into weeks, with sophisticated genetic therapies allowing for rapid physiological transformation. The psychological warfare component of the invasion was equally complex. Tyranid invasion strategies weren't just about physical consumption, but about generating comprehensive psychological destabilization. The bioforms were designed to generate specific electromagnetic and biochemical signals that could induce panic, confusion, and tactical disorientation among defending forces. Technological interfaces became critical. Standard Imperial weapons systems were rapidly modified to generate specific bioelectromagnetic disruption frequencies. Weapons were no longer just kinetic or energy delivery systems, but complex biological interference tools designed to directly combat the Tyranids' distributed intelligence networks. The genetic legacy of the Blood Angels became a crucial defensive asset. The chapter's unique genetic structures, previously seen as a liability, now represented a potential evolutionary advantage. The psychological intensity generated by the Black Rage could be strategically channeled creating units of Marines who could engage in levels of combat that defied traditional biological limitations. Logistical challenges were immense. Traditional supply lines became impossible, forcing the development of comprehensive on-site resource generation and recycling systems. Every piece of biological matter, including fallen combatants, became a potential resource in the ongoing defensive effort. The invasion would ultimately last for what Imperial historians would calculate as 72 standard days of continuous, high-intensity combat. Every moment represented a complex, multidimensional conflict that went far beyond traditional understandings of warfare, pushing the boundaries of biological, psychological, and technological engagement to their absolute limits. The aftermath of the Tyranid invasion transformed Dante from a chapter-level commander into a strategic asset of unprecedented imperial significance. His performance during the devastation of Baal had demonstrated capabilities that transcended traditional Space Marine leadership models, positioning him as a critical nexus of military and diplomatic power. Dante's interstellar strategy rejected the compartmentalized approach typical of most chapter masters, where other leaders maintained rigid organizational boundaries. He developed complex multi-chapter collaboration frameworks that allowed for unprecedented tactical and strategic integration. His diplomatic approach wasn't about formal protocols, but about creating living, adaptive, strategic networks that could respond rapidly to emerging threats. The Indomitus Crusade provided the primary platform for Dante's expanded influence. Robut Guilliman, returning from millennia of stasis, found in Dante a strategic partner who understood the complex psychological and genetic dynamics of post-heresy Space Marine organizations. Their interactions were not just military consultations, but intricate negotiations that would reshape imperial military doctrine. Diplomatic engagement with other chapter masters became a nuanced art form. Dante's approach went beyond traditional imperial hierarchies, focusing on identifying unique genetic, technological, and strategic capabilities within each chapter. He wasn't just building alliances, but creating a comprehensive understanding of the Imperium's distributed military potential. Technological collaboration became a critical focus. Dante developed comprehensive exchange protocols with Adeptus Mechanicus research divisions that allowed for rapid technological knowledge transfer. These weren't simple information exchanges, but complex genetic and technological interface mechanisms that could accelerate strategic innovation across multiple imperial organizations. The political landscape of the Imperium was extraordinarily complex. Traditional administrative structures had been systematically degraded over millennia, creating a fragmented governance model that relied more on personal relationships and strategic capabilities than on formal bureaucratic mechanisms. Dante became a critical bridge between various imperial institutions, able to navigate these complex political terrains with unprecedented skill. Intelligence gathering mechanisms were dramatically expanded. Where most chapter masters maintained relatively limited information networks, Dante developed multi-layered intelligence systems that could process strategic information across planetary, sector, and segmentum levels. This wasn't just about collecting more data, but about developing more sophisticated analytical frameworks that could identify emerging strategic patterns. Interactions with the Inquisition represented perhaps the most delicate diplomatic challenge. Dante's unique understanding of genetic engineering and psychological management made him a critical resource for organizations like the Ordo Xenos and Ordo Hereticus. His insights went beyond traditional threat assessment, offering comprehensive psychological and genetic analysis that could inform broader strategic decision-making. The economic dimensions of his strategic approach were equally sophisticated. Dante developed complex resource allocation and technological exchange protocols that went beyond traditional imperial economic models. These weren't just military logistics, but comprehensive ecosystem management strategies that could support entire sectors facing existential threats. Psychological warfare became a critical strategic dimension. Dante's understanding of complex genetic and psychological systems allowed for the development of strategic communication mechanisms that could systematically destabilize potential enemy structures. This wasn't traditional propaganda, but a sophisticated understanding of how information and psychological signals could be weaponized. Recruitment and genetic management protocols were standardized across multiple chapters through Dante's influence. His comprehensive approach to understanding genetic potential transformed recruitment from a simple numerical replacement strategy to a complex evolutionary management system. Chapters began to see potential recruits not just as individual warriors, but as potential strategic assets. Technological collaboration with the Adeptus Mechanicus reached unprecedented levels. Dante's unique insights into genetic engineering and psychological management made him a critical partner for technological innovation. Research divisions that had previously worked in isolated silos began developing more integrated approaches to technological and biological development. The diplomatic challenges were immense. The Imperium was not a unified organization, but a complex, fragmented system held together by increasingly tenuous connections. Dante's leadership style rejected traditional imperial bureaucratic approaches, focusing instead on developing flexible, adaptive, strategic networks that could respond rapidly to emerging threats. Strategic planning became a multi-dimensional chess game that went far beyond traditional military considerations. Dante's approach integrated genetic potential, psychological management, technological innovation, and complex systemic understanding into a comprehensive strategic framework that could address threats across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The scale of Dante's strategic vision was unprecedented. He wasn't just managing a chapter or even a sector, but developing comprehensive strategic frameworks that could potentially reshape entire segments of imperial military and administrative infrastructure. Each diplomatic engagement, each strategic consultation became a potential catalyst for systemic transformation. The arrival of Primaris Marines represented a genetic and strategic disruption that challenged fundamental assumptions about Space Marine development. Dante's initial response was not enthusiasm, but a deeply analytical skepticism rooted in centuries of genetic management experience with the Blood Angels. Genetic assessments of the first Primaris Marines revealed a level of biological complexity that went far beyond traditional Space Marine development protocols. Guilliman's genetic innovations weren't simple improvements, but a comprehensive reimagining of human biological potential. The Primaris represented a quantum leap in genetic engineering that made previous augmentation techniques look primitive by comparison. Dante's skepticism was grounded in the Blood Angel's unique genetic legacy. The chapter's complex psychological and biological challenges, particularly the Black Rage and Red Thirst, created a genetic environment that was fundamentally different from other Space Marine chapters. Standard genetic integration protocols would be insufficient for these new warriors. Initial testing revealed significant challenges. The Primaris' genetic structure, while extraordinarily stable, did not automatically interface with the existing Blood Angel's gene seed. Sophisticated genetic bridging technologies had to be developed to allow for seamless integration. This wasn't a simple genetic transplant, but a complex, multi-dimensional biological negotiation. Technological interventions became critical. Dante collaborated directly with Adeptus Mechanicus Genitors to develop specialized neural interface protocols that could help Primaris Marines navigate the psychological complexities of the Blood Angel's genetic legacy. These weren't just medical procedures, but complex psychological calibration mechanisms. The psychological assessment protocols were unprecedented. Each Primaris Marine underwent comprehensive genetic, neurological, and psychological screening that went far beyond traditional Space Marine recruitment processes. The goal wasn't just compatibility, but a comprehensive understanding of how these new warriors could be integrated into the chapter's complex genetic ecosystem. Combat doctrine transformation became a critical strategic focus. Primaris Marines brought technological capabilities that fundamentally challenged existing tactical frameworks. Their enhanced physiological capabilities, combined with more advanced weapon systems, required a complete reimagining of battlefield engagement strategies. Weapon system integration represented a particularly complex challenge. Standard Blood Angels equipment needed comprehensive modification to interface with Primaris biological systems. This wasn't just about physical compatibility, but about developing comprehensive technological ecosystems that could leverage the full potential of these new warriors. The psychological management strategies developed during this period were nothing short of revolutionary. Dante implemented comprehensive training programs that could help Primaris Marines understand and potentially mitigate the psychological challenges posed by the Black Rage and Red Thirst. These weren't suppression techniques, but complex psychological interface mechanisms. Genetic bridging technologies became a critical area of research. Specialized implants were developed that could help Primaris Marines interface more effectively with the existing Blood Angels' genetic infrastructure. These weren't simple medical interventions, but complex biological communication systems that could potentially modify genetic expression in real time. The broader imperial implications were immense. Dante's approach to Primaris integration became a model for other chapters struggling with similar genetic challenges. His comprehensive, analytically rigorous approach demonstrated that these new Marines weren't replacements, but potential evolutionary partners in the ongoing struggle for human survival. Recruitment protocols were completely overhauled. traditional selection mechanisms were replaced with comprehensive, multi-dimensional assessment frameworks that could identify potential Primaris candidates with unprecedented precision. Genetic potential was no longer just about physical capabilities, but about comprehensive biological adaptability. Technological collaboration with Adeptus Mechanicus research divisions reached unprecedented levels. Dante's team developed genetic mapping technologies that could predict potential integration challenges with remarkable accuracy. These weren't just medical technologies, but complex, predictive biological modeling systems. The strategic potential of Primaris Marines became increasingly clear. Their enhanced physiological capabilities, combined with more advanced technological interfaces, represented a fundamental transformation of Space Marine combat potential. Dante saw them not as replacements, but as a potential evolutionary step in human military development. Psychological training mechanisms were developed that could help both existing Blood Angels and new Primaris Marines navigate the complex genetic and psychological landscape of the chapter. These weren't simple training protocols, but comprehensive psychological interface technologies that could potentially modify genetic expression and psychological response patterns. The integration process was neither quick nor simple. Each Primaris Marine represented a complex biological and psychological integration challenge that required comprehensive, individualized approach. Dante's leadership during this period was characterized by an extraordinary level of analytical rigor and strategic vision. Battlefield testing became a critical validation mechanism. Comprehensive combat simulations were developed that could assess the full potential of Primaris traditional Marine integration. These weren't simple training exercises, but complex strategic validation mechanisms that could provide comprehensive insights into potential combat capabilities. The transformation of the Blood Angels was fundamentally about seeing genetic diversity not as a challenge, but as a strategic potential. Dante's approach rejected binary thinking about genetic integration, instead developing comprehensive, flexible frameworks that could leverage the unique capabilities of both traditional and Primaris Marines. The psychological landscape of Dante's leadership was fundamentally defined by an intimate, multi-generational struggle with the most profound genetic challenge in Space Marine history. The Black Rage was not merely a biological condition, but a living psychological wound that traced directly back to the moment of Sanguinius's death, a genetic memory so traumatic that it could transform a disciplined warrior into a near uncontrollable berserker in moments. Neurological assessments of Dante revealed something extraordinary. His genetic structure showed an unprecedented capacity to interface with and potentially mitigate the Black Rage, where most Marines would be completely consumed by the genetic memory of Sanguinius's terminal confrontation with Horus. Dante could essentially negotiate with these psychological fragments, maintaining a level of strategic awareness that defied conventional genetic understanding. The personal psychological burden was immense. Each Marine succumbing to the Black Rage represented not just a tactical loss, but a profound personal failure for Dante. He didn't just see these warriors as military assets, but as genetic descendants carrying the most complex psychological legacy in Imperial history. Every Marine lost to the genetic curse was, in some fundamental way, a repetition of Sanguinius's ultimate sacrifice. Technological interventions became increasingly sophisticated. Dante collaborated with the most advanced Adeptus Mechanicus genitors to develop neural stabilization protocols that went far beyond traditional psychological management techniques. These weren't simple suppression mechanisms, but complex genetic communication systems that could potentially negotiate with the traumatic genetic memories. The psychological management strategies developed during this period represented a quantum leap in genetic engineering. Specialized neural implants were developed that could create temporary psychological firewalls, essentially creating controlled zones where the Black Rage could be experienced without complete psychological disintegration. Marines could enter controlled states of genetic remembrance without losing their strategic capabilities. Recruitment and training protocols were completely reimagined. Potential Marines were no longer just assessed on physical capabilities, but on their potential psychological resilience. Sophisticated genetic screening mechanisms could now identify individuals with higher potential for managing the complex genetic legacy of the Blood Angels. Dante's personal psychological management became a critical area of research. Neurological scans revealed that he could enter controlled states of genetic remembrance, essentially experiencing the traumatic memories of Sanguinius without being completely consumed. This wasn't just psychological resistance, but a form of genetic communication that went beyond traditional understanding. The Death Company, the unit composed of Marines completely consumed by the Black Rage, was transformed from a simple containment mechanism to a strategic asset. Dante developed tactical deployment strategies that could leverage the extraordinary combat capabilities of Marines in this psychological state while maintaining a level of strategic control. Genetic research revealed that the Black Rage wasn't simply a weakness, but a complex survival mechanism. The psychological state generated by these genetic memories created warriors capable of levels of combat performance that defied traditional biological limitations. Marines in the grip of the Black Rage could continue fighting with devastating effectiveness, even after suffering wounds that would incapacitate normal combatants. Psychological training mechanisms were developed that could help Marines recognize and potentially manage the early stages of Black Rage. These weren't simple suppression techniques, but complex awareness protocols that could help warriors interface with their genetic memories without complete psychological disintegration. The broader imperial implications were profound. Dante's approach to managing the Blood Angels' genetic challenges became a critical case study for understanding complex genetic psychological conditions. His work went far beyond simple medical management, representing a comprehensive approach to understanding how traumatic genetic memories could be integrated rather than suppressed. Technological collaboration with Adeptus Mechanicus research divisions reached unprecedented levels. Specialized scanning technologies were developed that could map the complex psychological terrain of Marines experiencing the Black Rage. These weren't just medical technologies, but complex psychological mapping systems that could provide unprecedented insights into genetic memory. The psychological landscape of the chapter was fundamentally transformed. Where previously the Black Rage had been seen as an uncontrollable curse, Dante's leadership reframed it as a complex genetic communication mechanism. Marines were taught to see their genetic memories not as a weakness, but as a potential source of strength. Dante's personal psychological management became legendary within the chapter. He could enter controlled states of genetic remembrance that allowed him to experience the traumatic memories of Sanguinius while maintaining complete strategic awareness. This wasn't just psychological resistance, but a form of genetic communication that went beyond traditional understanding. The strategic potential of Marines experiencing the Black Rage was increasingly recognized. Their psychological state generated combat capabilities that went far beyond traditional physiological limitations. Marines in this state could continue fighting with a level of intensity and effectiveness that defied conventional understanding of biological combat potential. Psychological assessment technologies became increasingly sophisticated. Specialized scanning mechanisms could now provide real-time insights into a Marine's psychological state, allowing for unprecedented levels of genetic and psychological management. These weren't just medical technologies, but complex predictive systems that could identify potential psychological challenges before they became critical. The transformation of the Blood Angels' approach to the Black Rage was fundamentally about seeing genetic complexity not as a challenge, but as a potential strategic asset. Dante's leadership rejected simplistic suppression strategies, instead developing comprehensive frameworks that could leverage the unique psychological capabilities generated by the chapter's genetic legacy. The Cryptus campaign represented the first truly comprehensive test of Dante's strategic capabilities in a multi-dimensional conflict zone. When the Tyranid splinter fleet approached the Cryptus system, traditional Imperial defensive strategies would have failed catastrophically. Dante's approach rejected linear defensive protocols, instead developing a comprehensive ecosystem disruption strategy that transformed the entire planetary system into a living weapon against the Xenos invasion. Tactical analysis of the Cryptus engagement revealed something extraordinary. Dante didn't just defend territory, he systematically manipulated the biological infrastructure of multiple planetary systems to create massive, coordinated ecological traps for the Tyranid invasion force. Specialized atmospheric modification technologies were deployed that could generate localized environmental conditions hostile to Tyranid biological structures. Entire planetary atmospheres were transformed into complex chemical weapons platforms that could disrupt Tyranid genetic communication networks. The Gehenna intervention represented perhaps the most complex diplomatic military engagement of Dante's career. When a previously unknown Necron dynasty emerged in the Ultima Segmentum, traditional Imperial protocols would have triggered immediate total war. Dante developed a sophisticated, multi-dimensional engagement strategy that went beyond simple military confrontation. Specialized communication technologies were developed that could potentially interface with Necron communication systems, creating unprecedented opportunities for strategic negotiation. During the Indomitus Crusade, Dante's tactical capabilities were pushed to their absolute limits. The complex multi-front engagements required a level of strategic thinking that went far beyond traditional military leadership. Dante developed comprehensive strategic networks that could rapidly reconfigure defensive and offensive capabilities across multiple planetary systems. These weren't simple communication protocols, but complex, adaptive strategic ecosystems that could respond to emerging threats with unprecedented speed and complexity. The devastation of Baal remained the most comprehensive test of Dante's strategic potential. When the Tyranid hive fleet Leviathan approached, traditional imperial defensive strategies would have resulted in total planetary destruction. Dante's approach transformed the entire planetary system into a comprehensive defensive mechanism. Geological structures were systematically modified to create complex defensive terrain. Planetary ecosystems were transformed into living weapon platforms that could generate targeted biological disruption fields. The Macragge intervention demonstrated Dante's capacity for interchapter collaboration. When the Ultramarines faced critical challenges during a complex Xenos engagement, Dante's strategic support went far beyond traditional military assistance. Specialized tactical communication protocols were developed that could provide real-time strategic insights, transforming the entire engagement from a potentially catastrophic defeat into a comprehensive strategic victory. Technological innovations became a critical component of Dante's military strategy. Specialized weapon systems were developed that could generate complex electromagnetic disruption fields capable of systematically destabilizing enemy communication networks. These weren't simple kinetic or energy weapons, but complex biological interference technologies that could fundamentally disrupt enemy strategic capabilities. The Hexamrath campaign represented perhaps the most complex, multi-dimensional conflict in Dante's military career. When a previously unknown Xenos civilization emerged from the galactic rim, traditional Imperial engagement protocols would have triggered immediate total war. Dante developed a comprehensive strategic framework that went beyond military confrontation, creating complex diplomatic and technological interface mechanisms that could potentially transform the conflict into a strategic opportunity. Psychological warfare became an increasingly critical component of Dante's strategic approach. Specialized communication technologies were developed that could generate targeted psychological disruption signals. These weren't simple propaganda mechanisms, but complex biochemical communication systems that could fundamentally destabilize enemy strategic decision-making capabilities. The technological innovations developed during these campaigns went far beyond traditional military engineering. Specialized weapon systems were created that could interface directly with planetary ecological systems. Entire planetary defenses could be transformed into complex, adaptive combat organisms that could rapidly reconfigure based on emerging strategic requirements. Intelligence gathering mechanisms were dramatically expanded. Where previous Imperial strategies relied on relatively limited information networks, Dante developed multi-layered intelligence systems that could process strategic information across planetary, sector, and segmentum levels. These weren't simple communication protocols, but complex predictive modeling systems that could identify emerging strategic patterns with unprecedented accuracy. Recruitment and strategic deployment mechanisms were completely transformed. Traditional Imperial military protocols that viewed warriors as essentially replaceable assets were rejected. Each Marine was now seen as a complex strategic resource with unique potential capabilities. Deployment strategies were developed that could leverage the unique genetic and psychological capabilities of individual warriors. The scale of Dante's strategic vision was unprecedented. He wasn't just managing individual military engagements, but developing comprehensive strategic frameworks that could potentially reshape entire segments of imperial military infrastructure. Each battle became an opportunity to develop more sophisticated understandings of strategic potential. Technological collaboration with Adeptus Mechanicus research divisions reached extraordinary levels. Specialized research programs were developed that could rapidly develop and deploy technological innovations directly in combat environments. These weren't simple weapons development programs, but comprehensive strategic research ecosystems that could generate targeted technological solutions to emerging military challenges. The psychological dimensions of these campaigns were equally complex. Dante developed comprehensive psychological management protocols that could help Marines maintain strategic awareness even in the most challenging combat environments. These weren't simple training mechanisms, but complex psychological interface technologies that could fundamentally transform how warriors experienced and responded to combat stress. Dante's reputation transcended the traditional boundaries of Space Marine leadership, transforming him from a mere military commander into something approaching a living mythological construct within the Imperium. His extraordinary longevity became itself a form of psychological warfare, a walking testament to human resilience that challenged fundamental assumptions about biological limitations. Psychological assessments of Dante's impact revealed something extraordinary. Space Marines from multiple chapters began to view him not just as a leader, but as a kind of genetic and strategic prototype. Where most chapter masters were seen as institutional managers, Dante represented a comprehensive evolutionary model of human potential. His ability to navigate complex genetic, psychological, and strategic challenges suggested possibilities that went far beyond traditional understanding of human capability. The broader imperial psychological landscape was fundamentally transformed by Dante's existence. Imperial bureaucrats, typically dismissive of individual military leaders, found themselves developing complex psychological profiles that attempted to understand the mechanisms behind his extraordinary capabilities. Adeptus Mechanicus researchers developed specialized study programs dedicated to comprehending the biological and psychological mechanisms that allowed Dante to maintain such extraordinary operational effectiveness across centuries. Comparative analysis with other legendary imperial figures revealed unique characteristics. Unlike Guilliman, whose legendary status was primarily based on administrative and strategic capabilities, Dante represented a more holistic model of leadership. Where Primarch-level figures were often distant, almost mythological entities, Dante maintained a complex, nuanced relationship with both his warriors and the broader imperial infrastructure. Genetic researchers developed comprehensive, longitudinal studies attempting to understand the biological mechanisms behind Dante's extraordinary longevity. Specialized scanning technologies were developed that could map the complex genetic and physiological adaptations that allowed him to maintain operational effectiveness across multiple centuries. These weren't simple medical assessments, but complex evolutionary modeling systems that challenged fundamental assumptions about biological aging. The psychological impact on fellow Astartes was profound. Marines from multiple chapters began to develop complex narrative frameworks around Dante's leadership. He wasn't just a successful military commander, but a living embodiment of the Emperor's vision. A warrior who could maintain strategic awareness and psychological stability across extraordinary temporal and biological challenges. Technological innovations developed around understanding Dante's capabilities became a critical area of Imperial research. Specialized neural mapping technologies were created that could potentially identify and replicate the complex psychological management mechanisms that allowed him to maintain such extraordinary operational effectiveness. These weren't simple medical technologies, but comprehensive evolutionary research programs. Diplomatic interactions became increasingly complex, where most military leaders were constrained by institutional boundaries. Dante developed comprehensive strategic networks that could rapidly reconfigure based on emerging imperial requirements. His approach rejected traditional hierarchical communication protocols, instead developing fluid, adaptive engagement mechanisms. The mythological narrative surrounding Dante went far beyond simple military achievements. Imperial propaganda mechanisms developed complex narrative frameworks that presented him as a living embodiment of human potential. Recruitment materials, historical documentations, and strategic briefings increasingly referenced him not just as a military leader, but as a comprehensive evolutionary model. Psychological management technologies developed around studying Dante's capabilities represented a quantum leap in understanding human potential. Specialized neural interface mechanisms were created that could potentially help warriors develop more comprehensive psychological management capabilities. These weren't simple training protocols, but complex evolutionary research programs. Comparative analysis with other legendary imperial figures revealed the unique nature of Dante's leadership. Unlike the distant, almost mythological Primarchs, he maintained a complex, nuanced relationship with his warriors and the broader imperial infrastructure. His leadership style rejected traditional hierarchical communication mechanisms, instead developing fluid, adaptive engagement strategies. The technological and psychological innovations generated through studying Dante's capabilities went far beyond traditional military research. Specialized research programs were developed that could potentially identify and replicate the complex psychological management mechanisms that allowed him to maintain such extraordinary operational effectiveness across multiple centuries. Imperial cultural narratives began to develop increasingly complex frameworks around Dante's existence. He wasn't just a military leader, but a living embodiment of human potential. A warrior who could maintain strategic awareness and psychological stability across extraordinary temporal and biological challenges. Recruitment materials, historical documentations, and strategic briefings increasingly referenced him as a comprehensive evolutionary model. Genetic and psychological researchers developed increasingly sophisticated assessment mechanisms to understand the biological and psychological foundations of his extraordinary capabilities. Specialized scanning technologies were created that could map the complex genetic and physiological adaptations that allowed him to maintain operational effectiveness across multiple centuries. The broader imperial psychological landscape was fundamentally transformed by the narrative surrounding Dante, where most military leaders were viewed through relatively narrow institutional frameworks. He represented a comprehensive model of human potential that challenged fundamental assumptions about biological and psychological limitations. Technological collaborations with Adeptus Mechanicus research divisions reached unprecedented levels. Specialized research programs were developed that could potentially identify and replicate the complex psychological management mechanisms that allowed Dante to maintain such extraordinary operational effectiveness across multiple centuries. Diplomatic and strategic engagement mechanisms developed around Dante's capabilities represented a quantum leap in imperial strategic thinking. His approach rejected traditional hierarchical communication protocols, instead developing fluid, adaptive engagement strategies that could rapidly reconfigure based on emerging imperial requirements. Dante's longevity represented a biological and philosophical anomaly that challenged fundamental imperial understanding of human potential. Genetic assessments revealed a complex interplay of biological mechanisms that went far beyond traditional understanding of space marine physiology. Specialized Adeptus Mechanicus research divisions developed comprehensive longitudinal studies that attempted to map the extraordinary genetic adaptations, allowing Dante to maintain operational effectiveness across multiple centuries. Technological interventions became critical in understanding his biological sustainability. Specialized neural regenerative technologies developed through decades of complex research suggested that Dante's genetic structure contained unprecedented self-repair mechanisms. His cellular regeneration processes operated at levels that defied conventional biological understanding, creating a form of controlled biological stasis that went beyond standard space marine augmentation techniques. Philosophical implications of Dante's continuous service challenged core imperial conceptualizations of leadership and human potential. Where most military commanders are viewed as replaceable institutional assets, Dante represented a living historical continuity, a warrior who could maintain strategic awareness and institutional memory across multiple generational shifts. His existence suggested possibilities of human potential that went far beyond traditional biological limitations. Genetic research revealed extraordinary adaptive mechanisms within Dante's physiological structure. Specialized scanning technologies developed by Adeptus Mechanicus researchers identified complex genetic recalibration systems that could systematically manage cellular degradation. These weren't simple regenerative technologies, but comprehensive evolutionary management mechanisms that could potentially reset and optimize biological systems. The psychological dimensions of maintaining leadership across such extraordinary temporal spans represented a critical area of imperial research. Specialized psychological assessment technologies were developed to understand how Dante could maintain strategic awareness and emotional stability across multiple centuries of continuous service. These weren't simple psychological management protocols, but comprehensive evolutionary research programs. Technological collaborations reached unprecedented levels of complexity. specialized research divisions developed neural interface mechanisms that could potentially map and potentially replicate the extraordinary psychological management capabilities that allowed Dante to maintain such comprehensive strategic awareness across extraordinary temporal spans. The future of the Blood Angels under Dante's leadership represented a critical point of speculation within imperial strategic circles. Traditional leadership succession mechanisms seemed increasingly irrelevant when confronted with a leader who appeared to transcend conventional biological limitations. Recruitment and strategic deployment mechanisms were systematically reimagined to account for this extraordinary leadership model. Genetic and technological innovations generated through studying Dante's capabilities suggested possibilities that went far beyond traditional imperial understanding. Specialized research programs developed comprehensive evolutionary modeling systems that could potentially identify and replicate the complex biological and psychological mechanisms that allowed such extraordinary operational continuity. Imperial cultural narratives increasingly developed complex frameworks around Dante's existence. He wasn't just a military leader, but a living embodiment of human potential, a warrior who could maintain strategic awareness and psychological stability across extraordinary temporal and biological challenges. Recruitment materials, historical documentations, and strategic briefings increasingly referenced him as a comprehensive evolutionary model. Diplomatic and strategic engagement mechanisms developed around Dante's capabilities represented a quantum leap in imperial strategic thinking. His approach rejected traditional hierarchical communication protocols, instead developing fluid, adaptive engagement strategies that could rapidly reconfigure based on emerging imperial requirements. The broader philosophical implications suggested by Dante's existence challenged fundamental assumptions about human biological and psychological limitations, where most imperial strategic frameworks viewed warriors as essentially replaceable assets. Dante represented a comprehensive model of continuous leadership that suggested extraordinary possibilities of human potential. Technological innovations generated through studying his capabilities went far beyond traditional military research. Specialized research programs were developed that could potentially identify and replicate the complex psychological management mechanisms that allowed him to maintain such extraordinary operational effectiveness across multiple centuries. Speculation about the Blood Angels' future under Dante's leadership suggested a potential transformation of the entire chapter's operational and strategic capabilities. Traditional chapter succession mechanisms seemed increasingly irrelevant when confronted with a leader who appeared to transcend conventional, biological, and strategic limitations. The extraordinary nature of Dante's continuous service suggested possibilities that went far beyond traditional imperial understanding of leadership and human potential. His life transcended traditional biographical frameworks. A warrior who became more than a leader, more than a legend, embodying the absolute potential of human resilience in the face of unimaginable challenges across the blood-soaked millennia of the Imperium's continuous struggle for survival.